What's up, night owls? Welcome back to Demon Sleep. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I personally read every single one of them, and honestly, it makes my day seeing you all from around the world. If these dark tailies help you drift off or just escape reality for a bit, smash that like button and subscribe. But only if you think we've earned it. No pressure. Alright, lights off, rain on, blankets up. Let's dive into tonight's nightmare fuel, the Russian sleep experiment. What happened in those 15 days? The door opened at 3:47 hours on the 15th day. What the soldiers saw inside made one of them fire his weapon into the ceiling, not as a warning, not by accident, but because it was the only response his nervous system could produce. 4 of the 5 test subjects were still alive. They did not want to leave. They did not want the gas to stop. They did not want to be saved. That is where this story ends. Now let us go back to where it began. There are thresholds in the architecture of consciousness that the waking mind is, by design, forbidden from crossing. This is not metaphor. This is not philosophical abstraction. This is biology operating as mercy, the sleep cycle existing not merely to rest the body, as the textbooks of lesser centuries once proposed, but to prevent the accumulation of something for which no clinical terminology was, at the time of this account, adequate. Consider what occurs when a mammalian organism is deprived of sleep for extended periods. The hallucinations that arise are not random noise produced by a malfunctioning brain. They are, I would submit, and the evidence I shall present supports this submission with a specificity that allows no comfortable dismissal, a form of perception, a form of vision. The sleeping mind is kept ignorant of certain truths not because those truths do not exist, but because the waking mind, confronted with their full weight, cannot survive the encounter. The Soviet research program designated under classification in KVD 1947, XD7, was not, as its surface documentation suggests, a study of stimulant compounds. It was not a program designed to produce soldiers capable of fighting without rest, though this was the cover notation in every filed report, and I suspect it was the sincere belief of every administrator who stamped those files without reading them. The true aim determined not from Soviet records, which remain officially non-existent, but from accounts I have gathered across 3 decades of investigation into documents that several governments on separate continents have independently seen fit to suppress, was something at once simpler and so categorically beyond ordinary ambition that describing it in plain language produces an effect not unlike trying to pour the ocean into a teacup. They wish to know what lies on the other side of sleep. Not the dream state, not the hypnagogic threshold, not the deep architecture of REM that the brain enters during its nightly maintenance cycles. Beyond all of that, past the point where the human mind evolved over hundreds of thousands of years of darkness and fire and predator awareness, has ever willingly gone. They had reason to believe that something existed there, something that the sleep cycle, as faithfully as a sentinel, prevented ordinary consciousness from approaching. The gas they developed, and I will not describe its chemistry here, partly because the formula has never been declassified, and partly because I have reason to believe that simply knowing it constitutes a category of danger that no reader of this account should accept casually, was not designed to merely prevent sleep. It was designed to push the mind across the threshold that sleep protects. 5 subjects were selected. The chamber was sealed on October 9, 1947. What happened inside that chamber in the 15 days that followed, the sounds that were recorded, the behaviors documented, the things that the researchers watching through the observation glass came to understand about the nature of the human mind in its most exposed and undefended state, is what I am here to record. I must tell you, before I begin, what this investigation cost the people closest to it. 3 of the 5 researchers who witnessed the final state of the subjects were committed to psychiatric institutions within 8 months of the experiment's conclusion. 1 left the Soviet Union entirely and was not located until 1973, at which point he was discovered living under an assumed name in a rural province of Finland. where he had not spoken a word to another human being in over 20 years. His journals contain one entry, dated November 1947, 2 weeks after the chamber was opened. That consists of a single sentence repeated 411 times without variation or punctuation. I will not reproduce that sentence here. What I will tell you is this: the horror of the Russian sleep experiment does not lie in what the gas did to the subjects' bodies. The body's response was documented and is, in its own grotesque way, comprehensible. The horror lies in what the subjects reported experiencing. The horror lies in what they had come to understand. The horror lies in what they did not want to stop feeling. They had been somewhere. Something had shown them a place that existed on the far side of sleep, past the threshold where the mind is kept by biology's most ancient mercy. And it was not darkness. Alexei Volkov was 31 years old, and he was thinking about bread. Specifically, he was thinking about the black bread his mother used to make in their apartment in Leningrad, dense and sour, and slightly burnt on one side, always, because the oven in that apartment had a hot spot on the left that his mother had never gotten around to adjusting for, even after 17 years of living there. He was thinking about how she'd cut it in thick slices and lay it on the table next to whatever the meal was, and how the smell of it filled the whole two-room apartment like something warm and purposeful and alive. He was thinking that he hadn't been home in 8 months. He was thinking that, when this posting was done, he was going to take the train to Leningrad and sit at his mother's table and eat that bread until he didn't want any more. He was a tall man, Alexei, lean in the way that people who grew up without quite enough get lean efficiently, without waste. He had his father's hands, which was to say large and square-knuckled and always slightly chapped from the cold, and his mother's eyes, which were the dark, attentive kind that made people think he was listening very carefully to what they were saying even when he wasn't. He'd been in the program for 11 months. Before that, 3 years in signals intelligence, which was boring in the way that war work is boring, the boredom that sits on top of something fundamentally terrible and prevents you from looking directly at it. He'd volunteered for the Ural experiment the way you volunteer for anything in the Soviet system. The question is asked in a particular way that makes the answer obvious. He didn't know what the experiment was exactly. They told him it was a stimulant study, extended wakefulness research, cutting-edge science for the motherland. He'd be in the chamber for 30 days. They'd monitor him. There'd be food delivered through a slot in the sealed wall. There'd be books. There'd be 4 other men. What he knew about the other 4, their names, their unit designations, their rough ranks. Dmitry Cheskov was a former army engineer, bald and businesslike, the kind of man who seemed to have made peace with everything in his life except inefficiency. Nikolai Morozov was young, 24 maybe, and kept smiling slightly, like he'd heard a joke recently and hadn't quite finished being amused by it. Pyotr Garanin was a large, quiet man with a scar across his left forearm that he never explained and no one asked about. And Vasily, Alexei, never got his last name, which struck him as odd, since they had 5 minutes of introductions before the door closed. The chamber was roughly the size of a large hotel room. There were 5 cots. There were books and papers. There were electric lights that stayed on. There was an intercom through which the researchers could speak to them and they could speak back. There was a toilet alcove behind a curtain. There were observation windows of reinforced glass, set high in one wall. They could not see the researchers clearly, only shapes, occasionally, but they knew they were being watched. The gas entered through vents in the floor. You couldn't smell it exactly. It was more of an absence of something like air with one element removed. An element you hadn't known was there until it was gone. By the end of the first hour, Alexei didn't feel anything particular. He sat on his cot, thought about his mother's bread, read 30 pages of a novel he didn't find interesting, and thought that 30 days in this room was going to be dull but manageable. He noticed the fluorescent light above his cot had a tiny flicker, so fast and faint it was almost subliminal. He noticed it, Then he rationalized it. Old fixture, bad connection, nothing to worry about. He was wrong about that. He was going to be wrong about a lot of things. By the end of day 2, Alexei had established a routine, because that's what Alexei did. He was a routine man in the way that some men are, not rigidly, not obsessively, but with the quiet competence of someone who understood that structure was what separated a manageable situation from chaos. He woke at what his body told him was morning. He did 20 minutes of exercise with push-ups, squats, the kind of thing he could do in a small space. He ate whatever had been slid through the food slot. He read, he talked to the other men. The talking was easier than he'd expected. Dmitry Cheskov turned out to be funny in the dry, exhausted way that engineers sometimes are. His humor came from an extremely precise awareness of how badly things could go wrong at any given moment, and the relief he felt when they didn't. The light above my cot, he told Alexei on day 2, flickers at irregular intervals. I've timed it. The longest gap between flickers was 11 minutes. The shortest was 3 seconds. If the intervals shorten over time, I'll know the fixture is failing. If they lengthen, it might be interference from the observation equipment. He paused. I've also considered that I might be wrong and it just flickers. Morozov, the young one, kept reading a philosophy textbook that he'd brought in, dense Soviet materialist philosophy, the kind that was obligatory rather than interesting. He highlighted things and wrote notes in the margins in extremely small letters. When Alexei asked him what he was studying, Morozov said consciousness, without looking up, which seemed both appropriate and slightly unsettling in a way that Alexei told himself was just the context. Pyotr Garanin barely spoke. Not rudely, he responded when addressed. He ate with the group. He participated in the minimal social rhythms of 5 men in a room. But he had the quality of a man who had decided, long ago, that most words were unnecessary and had arranged his life accordingly. He slept when they were supposed to sleep, though the gas prevented it, or was supposed to prevent it. On day 2, Garanin lay on his cot and closed his eyes, and after an hour his breathing had slowed into something that looked unmistakably like sleep. The researchers noticed. Alexei saw one of the shapes behind the observation glass move quickly, confer with another, but nothing happened. The gas continued. Vasily was the one Alexei hadn't gotten a last name from. That kept bothering him in the background, like a song half remembered. Vasily was ordinary in every surface detail. Medium height, medium build, brown hair going slightly gray at the temples, unremarkable face. But he had a quality of attention that was unusual. He listened to conversations without appearing to listen. He watched the observation windows without appearing to watch them. When he spoke, rarely. Whatever he said landed differently than it should have, like a pebble thrown into still water that produces waves slightly too large for the size of the stone. On the morning of day 3, Alexei noticed that Vasily's cot showed no sign of having been slept in. Not unusual, none of them had slept, but Vasily also showed no signs of sleeplessness, no redness in the eyes, no dragging quality to the voice. He looked, in fact, better rested than he had on day 1. Alexei asked him about it. Vasily looked at him for a moment with those attentive, ordinary eyes. Then he said, "I feel different. Don't you feel different?" Alexei said he felt fine. But standing there, looking back at Vasily's ordinary, watchful face, he was aware that the flickering light above his cot had changed. It was slower now, more regular, almost like a pulse. He told himself it was the fixture failing. He told himself it was Cheskov's prediction coming true. He was wrong about that too. By day 5, Alexei had stopped exercising. Not because he decided to, he just forgot. He woke up on the 5th morning being a relative term, the lights didn't change, there was no window, time was only what your body insisted on, and the thought of exercise didn't occur to him. He ate, he sat, he thought about things. The quality of his thinking had changed in a way that interested him and worried him in roughly equal proportion. He was thinking more clearly than usual, sharper. The novel he'd been reading was suddenly fascinating in ways it hadn't been before. Not because the writing had improved, obviously, but because he was finding levels in it that he'd skimmed over before, connections between ideas that now seemed dense with significance. He told himself this was the known effect of reduced brain activity during wakefulness without sleep. The mind becomes more alert as the body conserves energy. He'd read this. He was almost certain he'd read this. Morozov confirmed it, sort of. On day 5, Morozov put down his philosophy textbook and announced that he understood it now. All of it, he said, not with excitement but with a kind of heavy satisfaction. Like a man who has finally put down a weight he's been carrying for years. Every chapter, I can see where each argument leads. I can see where they're wrong and what they'd have to say instead to be right. He picked the book back up. It's actually quite sad. They were so close. Dmitry Cheskov was less philosophical about the changes. I'm not sleeping, he said on day 5, pulling Alexei aside as you could manage in a room that size and speaking quietly. We're not sleeping. That's the experiment. They're keeping us awake. And I need you to tell me honestly, are you feeling what I'm feeling? Because what I'm feeling is very good, and that is specifically what concerns me. Alexei told him honestly, yes, he was feeling very good. Right, Cheskov said. Right. He rubbed his jaw. He looked at the observation windows. In engineering, when a system starts performing better than its parameters suggest it should, there's a reason. Either your parameters are wrong, or something is happening to the system that you haven't accounted for. Neither answer is necessarily good news. Alexei knew this was sensible. He filed it somewhere in the back of his mind as important. 2 hours later, he'd forgotten the conversation entirely. That was day 5. On day 6, Garanin stopped speaking altogether. Not out of the quiet competence that had characterized his silence before, this was different. He sat at the edge of his cot, very still, with his head slightly tilted in the posture of a man listening to something the others couldn't hear. When Alexei put a hand on his shoulder, Garanin turned and looked at him. His eyes were completely clear, alert, absolutely calm. Can you hear that? Garanin asked. Alexei listened. He heard the ventilation, the hum of the lights, his own breathing. I don't hear anything, Alexei said. Garanin held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to whatever he was listening to, and he didn't speak again for 3 days. When he did, it wasn't in Russian, not in any language Alexei recognized. And here is the part nobody talks about, the part left out of every news report, every official account, every interview, because the people who knew, the ones who were actually there, made a decision. They decided some things were better left unsaid. They were wrong, and tonight you're going to hear why. The microphone was live on day 7 when Alexei made his decision. There was an intercom. He'd mentioned it before. A speaker and button system on the wall near the food slot through which he could communicate with the research team in the observation room. He hadn't used it much. None of them had. The team occasionally broadcast messages through it, check-ins, instructions, brief clinical inquiries about their physical states. And they answered, but the conversations were short and impersonal. The way conversations with authority tend to be when you're on the inside of a locked room, and the authority is on the outside. On day 7, Alexei pressed the button and said, I think something is wrong with Garanin. There was a pause, the kind that feels like more than a technical delay. Then a voice, calm and professional and young-sounding. Can you describe his behavior? Alexei described it, the stillness, the listening posture, the language that wasn't a language, the way his eyes tracked something none of the others could see. Then, this is within expected parameters. Continue to monitor and report any changes. Alexei looked at the speaker for a moment. He thought, expected parameters. He thought about what Cheskov had said, that a system performing above parameters was either explained by wrong parameters or something unaccounted for. He thought about Vasily, who still looked better rested each morning. He thought about the clearness of his own thinking, which was starting to feel less like clarity and more like the sensation of a TV screen, where the contrast has been turned up too high. Everything's sharp and bright, and somehow wrong for being too sharp and too bright. He pressed the button again. "I want to leave," he said. "I want to request release from the program." The pause this time was longer. "That option is not currently available," the voice said. "The integrity of the experiment requires the chamber remain sealed." Alexei nodded at the speaker like the young researcher could see him. He was very calm about this, which was itself the first real sign that something was wrong, because the correct response to being told you cannot leave a sealed room when you've asked to leave is not calm. It is panic. It is anger. It is the very human insistence on the animal right of exit. Alexei felt none of those things. He pressed the button one more time. "What is the gas for?" he asked. "The real reason." The speaker clicked, went dead, stayed dead for 4 minutes. Then the young researcher's voice came back, and it was slightly different now, still controlled, but with something underneath it that Alexei recognized distantly as the sound of a person who has been told what to say by someone standing next to them. "The stimulant compound assists in maintaining wakefulness. It has no other effects." Alexei said, "Then why can I hear the ventilation system from 3 rooms away?" The speaker went dead again. This time it stayed dead. He turned back to the room. Morozov was reading, or appearing to read. His eyes were on the pages but not moving. Cheskov was sitting very still with his eyes closed in a way that had stopped looking like sleep and started looking like concentration. Garanin was in the corner, cross-legged, lips moving slightly around sounds that carried no vowel patterns Alexei could identify. And Vasily was standing at the observation window, looking up at the dark glass with his ordinary brown eyes and his ordinary face, and he was smiling. Not threateningly, not madly, just smiling in the specific, private way of a man who has figured something out that everyone around him has not yet understood. And here is the part nobody talks about, the part left out of every news report, every official account, every interview, because the people who knew, the ones who were actually there, made a decision. They decided some things were better left unsaid. They were wrong, and tonight you're going to hear why. The intercom had been silent for 2 days. The food still came, on schedule precisely. The slot opened and the tray appeared and the slot closed. The food was normal: bread, soup, a kind of pale meat in gravy. The portions were the same as they had been on day 1. Someone on the other side of the wall was still maintaining the schedule. What had changed? The quality of the silence between the men. It was not that they had stopped talking. They talked, but the conversations had begun to have gaps in them, not the natural pauses of dialogue, but longer silences, during which all 4 men would seem to be listening to the same thing, then would return to what they were saying as though the gap had not occurred. Alexei noticed this on the 8th day. He noticed it the way you notice that a door you always close at night is now always open in the morning, quietly, with the specific vertigo of a wrongness you cannot quite locate. The light above his cot still flickered. He had stopped timing it. Cheskov had stopped talking about engineering. This was notable because Cheskov's engineering observations had been, up to this point, as constant and reliable as the food slot. Now he sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the far wall. When Alexei sat beside him and asked what he was thinking, Cheskov said, "I'm not thinking." Then, after a pause, "I think I used to think all the time. I don't remember when that stopped." The books were still there. No one was reading them. On day 8, Alexei counted the tiles in the floor for the second time. There were 47. He was certain of this. He had counted them carefully. But when he counted them again on day 9, he reached 51. And when he counted them a third time that same evening, he got 47 again. He did not mention this to anyone. The food on Vasily's tray on the morning of day 9 was untouched. Alexei noticed this. The tray was collected through the slot. A fresh tray came at the next meal time. That tray's food was also untouched, and Vasily seemed unconcerned about this, and he was, if anything, looking healthier than ever, his color good, his eyes bright, his movements easy and economical. Alexei did not ask him about it. At some point on what he believed was the 9th day, Alexei sat on his cot and realized that the hum of the ventilation, which had always been there, always steady background noise, had stopped. The vents were still operating. He could feel the faint movement of air, but the sound it made had changed. It was no longer mechanical. It was something else. Something that, if he listened to it long enough, began to resolve into patterns that almost sounded like. He stopped listening. The light above his cot was no longer flickering. It had stopped flickering sometime in the last 12 hours. He hadn't noticed when. It burned now with a steady, even light, which should have been a relief, except that steady light was what it was supposed to have been doing from the beginning, and the fact that it was only now doing it felt, in a way he could not explain, like the most wrong thing in the room. On the night of day 9, there were no nights. The lights didn't change, but his body still believed in nights. Alexei lay on his cot and discovered that he no longer wanted to sleep. This was different from not being able to sleep. The gas, presumably, was preventing that. But in the early days, there had still been the desire, the normal mammalian pull toward unconsciousness that arrives after extended wakefulness, the way the body insists on its rest even when circumstances deny it. That pull was gone. He was not tired. He was not anything that the word tired could describe. He was awake in a way that sleeping felt like it would ruin. The way you feel in the middle of a perfect, clear day when someone suggests going inside. He lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling and was perfectly comfortable. The man in the next cot, Morozov, was also awake. They both lay there without speaking for what Alexei estimated was 3 hours. Then Morozov said, without preamble, "I've been thinking about the gas." Alexei said that was reasonable. "Not as a stimulant," Morozov said. "As a key. Keys don't make you more awake, they open things." Alexei thought about this. He thought a key. He thought, what does a key open? He thought about what was on the other side of a door. He'd been standing in front of his whole life without knowing the door was there. Morozov said, "I think I can hear what Garanin is hearing." Alexei turned his head. Garanin was in the corner, in the dark part where the light didn't quite reach. He was in the same cross-legged position he'd been in for 2 days. His lips were still moving. The sounds he made were still not any language, but in the sustained, patient quiet of that room on the 9th night, Alexei thought, for just one moment, one sliver of clarity, that the part of him still tethered to the ordinary world immediately tried to classify as a hallucination. He thought he understood one word, and it was his own name. The observation logs for days 10 through 13 were filed. They exist. They have been partially accessed through channels that I will describe in a later section, and what they contain, in clinical, bureaucratic, carefully neutral language, is this: the subject's vital signs remained stable. Their communication became intermittent but continued. Their physical health showed no significant deterioration. What the observation logs do not record is what the researchers behind the glass saw with their own eyes, what they heard, what they stopped writing down somewhere around day 11, and what one researcher, the youngest, a 23-year-old graduate assistant named only as Petrov in the records that survive, described in a letter to his sister that was confiscated 2 weeks after it was written and has not been publicly accessible since. The relevant passage, as reported by someone who read it before confiscation: "They are not sleeping. They are not suffering. That is the worst part." Gorchakov came off his shift this morning and would not speak for 4 hours. When he did speak, he said they look like men who have found something they were looking for. He said it in the way you might say it if what had been found was something that should not be found. Back in the chamber, the food trays were still being received, but what was happening to the food was no longer straightforward. Some trays came back empty. Some came back untouched. On day 10, one tray came back with the food rearranged into a pattern, geometric, careful, not random. that the researchers could not categorize in their notes beyond the phrase intentional arrangement, purpose unknown. The intercom remained silent from both sides. The four men, Vasily, Alexei, Morozov, and Cheskov, Garanin had stopped moving entirely, sitting in his corner like a figure in a painting, occupied the space with a quietness that the observation staff described in their log as calm. But calm is a word that describes the surface of a deep lake. It says nothing about what is below. Something was below. On day 12, one of the observation windows developed a crack, a single hairline fracture in the reinforced glass, beginning at the upper left corner and extending diagonally to the center. The engineering assessment logged the following morning attributed it to thermal stress. The engineer who wrote that assessment quit his position within 6 weeks. The crack had not been there on day 11. On the other side of the glass, Vasily was looking directly at the window. He had been looking at it for 2 days. Not always, not continuously. But every time a researcher looked through the glass, Vasily was facing the window, looking up at it with his ordinary face and his ordinary eyes. The crack spread another ½ centimeter over the following 24 hours. No one ordered the chamber unsealed. One sentence in the log for day 12, written in a different handwriting from the entries before and after it, as though inserted later. Subject 5 Vasily has not consumed food in 6 days. Vital signs normal. Weight unchanged. October 18th, 1947. Day 10 of the experiment. 14:32 hours. This is documented. The NKVD's internal archive. The portion accessed by 3 independent researchers between 1993 and 2007, in the brief window when certain Soviet-era files were technically accessible before being reclassified, contains a file designated XD7 Progress Report, pages 1 through 47. Pages 48 through 89 are missing, not destroyed, missing. The catalog entry for those pages still exists. The physical documents do not. What pages 1 through 47 establish? The facility was located in the Ural Mountains, 340 kilometers east-northeast of Perm. The chamber measured 9 meters by 6 meters by 3.2 meters ceiling height. The gas supply was continuous through floor-level venting, drawn from a sealed tank system maintained under the chamber's subfloor. The gas compound is listed in the surviving documents as Compound 7Xi with the notation, classified, do not reproduce formula. The gas had been tested on animals prior to the human trial. The animal trials were terminated after 7 days. The termination reason is listed as outcome inconsistent with experimental parameters. No further detail. The 5 subjects were all volunteers officially, all male, ages 24 through 37, all with military backgrounds, all with, and this phrase appears verbatim in the intake assessments, limited external social obligations. Translation: men without families who would raise alarms if contact was lost. Sergeant Andrei Kovalov, Facility Security, November 1947. I worked the perimeter. Never went inside, but I heard them. Around day 8-9, you could hear them through the ventilation shafts if you were in the right corridor. It wasn't screaming. That's what people always assume. It wasn't screaming. It was talking, but fast, too fast. Like if you played a record at the wrong speed, except it was getting faster every day. By day 10, you couldn't make out individual words. It just sounded like a frequency, something tuning itself. Kovalov requested a transfer on October 21st. It was denied. He did not speak publicly about the experiment until 1989. The documentation on file for day 10 confirms that all 5 subjects remained physically healthy by every measurable metric. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, all within normal ranges. No muscular deterioration. No neurological indicators of the psychosis that prolonged sleep deprivation is clinically documented to produce within 6 to 11 days in standard subjects. That last fact cannot be explained by any pharmacological effect of compound 7-zy, whose formula remains classified. It cannot be explained at all. October 20th, 1947, day 12, 09:15 hours. Dr. Vasily Gorchakov, senior researcher, 12 years with the program, filed what would be his final clinical assessment at 09:15 on day 12. Then did not appear for his afternoon shift. He was found in the facility's second-floor records room at 22:40 by a security patrol, sitting in the dark, with a stack of blank paper in front of him and a pen in his hand. He had been writing on the blank paper. The marks he was making were not letters. Dr. Irina Semenova, junior researcher, testimony from 1963 declassified interview. I was there when they found Gorchakov. I was one of the 2 people who walked into that room. He looked up at us when we came in perfectly calm, completely aware of where he was. He recognized us. He said our names. Then he said, "They showed me what it is." We asked him what he meant. He picked up one of the sheets of paper with the markings on it and held it out toward us. He said, "This is what it sounds like written down." We looked at the paper. I can't tell you what the markings looked like because I can't. I can tell you that I destroyed my notes from that day, and that I haven't slept in a room without a light on since October 1947. Dr. Semenova was dismissed from the program on October 28th. She spent the following 14 years as a general practitioner in Novosibirsk. She died in 1978. The declassified interview is the only public statement she ever made about the experiment. Inside the chamber on the morning of day 12, the first blood appeared. The medical log records it clinically. Minor self-inflicted laceration observed on subject 3 Morozov, left forearm, estimated 4 cm in length. Subject appears unaware of injury. No distress displayed. Wound not treated. What the medical log does not record. Morozov was awake and alert when the laceration was made. He was sitting at the room's small table. He had used the edge of his food tray. He made the cut slowly, deliberately, and then held his arm over the table and watched the blood collect on the surface with the focused, interested expression of a man conducting a personal experiment of his own. Then he dipped his finger in it and drew something on the table. The observation team photographed what he drew. The photograph is in the missing pages. October 21 ST 1947, day 13, 07:00 hours. The mythology is older than the Soviet Union, older than Russia. In pre-Christian Slavic tradition, there is an entity referred to in various regional texts as Dremeval, roughly translated as the dreaming thing, or, in certain Eastern dialects, what watches while you sleep. It is not a demon in the European Christian sense. It is not a spirit exactly. The oldest recorded references, found in early medieval Novgorodian manuscripts preserved in the Russian State Archive, describe it as a presence, something that exists in the space between sleep and waking, something that the sleeping mind moves through without awareness the way a fish moves through water, something that ordinary consciousness never encounters because ordinary consciousness spends its nights in the unconscious realm where this presence exists, rather than in the waking realm where the encounter would be possible. The manuscripts describe, in several independent accounts from different centuries, what happens when a person remains awake long enough to stand at the border of both realms simultaneously. They describe the sounds that begin, the clarity of perception, the communications that become possible, and they describe, in language that varies by century but remains consistent in detail, what the entity that inhabits that border looks like from the waking side. The manuscripts were first brought to Soviet scholarly attention in 1939. The connection to compound 7-zy was made by a researcher whose name has been redacted from the surviving documentation. Dr. Marta Volkov, Slavic Folklore Studies, University of Moscow, written statement, 1994. The pre-Christian materials are unambiguous. Whatever the border state experience represents, whether we interpret it as neurological phenomenon or something less classifiable. The cultural record of what occurs within it is remarkably consistent across 12 centuries and at least 7 distinct regional traditions. The specific detail that appears in every account, without exception, is this: those who reached the border came back with knowledge they had not sought and could not explain, and none of them, not one, across all the accounts, reported wanting to come back. The formula for Compound 7-Xi was developed between 1940 and 1946. The pre-Christian manuscripts were translated into research notation in 1941. The experiment began in October 1947. What I am about to tell you is documented. It is on record. It exists in files that are technically public but practically inaccessible. I found them. I read every page. You need to hear what is inside, because what happened once is still happening. On day 13, Alexei realized he couldn't remember his mother's name. He was sitting on his cot, doing what he'd been doing for the last 2 days, a kind of concentrated non-thinking that had replaced what used to be reading, used to be exercise, used to be conversation. And he reached back for his mother's name with the automatic confidence of someone reaching into a pocket they've used 10,000 times, and the pocket was empty. He told himself, Natasha, no Maria. He wasn't sure. He tried to see her face and could see it sharp, clear, clearer than he'd ever seen it in memory. Every line and angle and the way her hair was always slightly wrong on the left side, but the name that went with the face was simply not there. He tried to work backward. He tried her maiden name and got nothing. Her husband's name, his father's name, and got nothing. He tried his own last name and got nothing. Volkov, his own last name. He had to look at the ID card in his front pocket to confirm it. He sat with the ID card in his hands for what he estimated was an hour. He looked at the name on it, Alekseidimitrivichvolkov. The photograph of his face looked back at him. He knew the face. It was a familiar face. He was, in all the ways that counted, certain it was his face. He was less certain whose face it was. Cheskov found him like that, sitting with the ID card, staring at it. Cheskov sat across from him and didn't speak for a while, which was unlike Cheskov, and then said, "How much do you remember?" Not "Are you okay?" Not "What's wrong?" How much do you remember? Alexei said, "Not much." Cheskov nodded, saying, "Names go first. I figured out why. We don't need them here. Names are their indexing systems, ways of accessing things from the outside, but we're not on the outside anymore." He stopped. That sentence made sense when I started it. Alexei said, "I know it still makes sense." Because it did. That was the thing that should have been terrifying and wasn't. The fact that what was happening to him made a kind of sense that the ordinary mind wasn't equipped to evaluate. The way a man who has never seen a deep-sea fish can evaluate whether it's healthy or dying, because he has no reference point for what healthy looks like down there. Got up to use the toilet. On the way back, he passed Vasily, who was standing, not sitting, not lying down, standing in the middle of the room. Vasily looked at him with those ordinary eyes. They had stopped being ordinary sometime in the last 3 days. Not that anything in them had visibly changed. They were the same eyes, but they reflected light differently. The way very deep water reflects light differently from shallow water, technically the same process, but the depth changes what it looks like. "We can't leave," Alexei said. "Not a request, not a complaint, just numbing the situation." Vasily said, "We could always leave. The option just isn't attractive anymore." Alexei processed this. He thought, the option isn't attractive. He thought, I pressed the intercom button 8 days ago and asked to leave and meant it completely, and could not mean it completely now even if I tried. He thought, what has been done to me? He thought almost immediately after, what has been opened in me? On day 14, there was a knock on the other side of the door. Not the food slot, the actual door, the sealed steel door with the bolts on the outside that hadn't been opened since day 1. A knock, 3 times, pause 2 times, like a code. like someone on the outside who wanted in. All four of them, Alexei, Cheskov, Morozov, Garanin still in his corner, looked at the door. Even Garanin turned his head, which was the first time he'd responded to an external stimulus in over 48 hours. Vasily walked to the door. He put his palm flat against it. He held it there. The knock came again, 3 paws too. Vasily said quietly to no one in particular, "Not yet." The knocking stopped. Alexei found himself breathing for what felt like the first time in days, real breathing, sharp and gasping and human. The kind of breathing that reminded him he had a body and the body required air, and the body was a real thing in a real room with real walls. The knocking, the 3-2 knock, had done it, had pulled him back. It was a human gesture, someone on the other side, someone with a pattern. It smelled like the real world, like the before world, like bread in his mother's kitchen, and the specific sound of the train from Leningrad. He was awake, he was himself. Then Vasily took his palm off the door and turned around, and his face had changed in a way that Alexei could not fully describe then and cannot fully describe now. Not monstrous, not dramatic, simply more, as though the surface of it had become transparent enough to see what was behind it, and what was behind it was so far back that human eyes couldn't focus on it properly. He looked at Alexei and said, "They're going to open the door." Alexei thought, good, the cavalry, the outside, the before world. He thought, we'll go home. He thought briefly, warmly, completely, bread. Then he looked at Garanin in the corner, cross-legged, lips still moving, something still emerging from his throat in frequencies that language had long stopped shaping. He looked at Morozov, who was writing, had been writing, without paper, his finger tracing shapes on the air in front of him, with a concentration so total it looked like the world's most important work. He looked at Cheskov, who had his eyes closed and was smiling in the careful, contained way of a man who has located the solution to a problem that has consumed his life. He thought, go home. He thought, to what? October 23 RD 1947, day 15, 03:31 hours. The order to open the chamber came from above Gorchakov's replacement, above his replacement superior. It came, the surviving documentation suggests, from a level of the program that is not named in any accessible record. The order read in full, terminate experiment, extract subjects, preserve integrity of compound data. The soldier who opened the door, Private First Class Dmitry Lazar, Ural Regional Garrison, later transferred to an undisclosed posting from which he never returned to civilian life, described what he saw in the 2 seconds before the soldier beside him fired his weapon into the ceiling as follows. 4 men alive, standing, not sitting, not lying, not doing anything that sleep deprivation should have left them capable of doing, standing, evenly distributed around the room, in a formation that Lazarev later described as like they were waiting. Their eyes were open. Their color was good. They were upright and alert and had been awake for 15 days without rest. They did not reach for the door. They did not step toward the light from the corridor. They looked at Lazarev and the soldiers behind him with expressions that Lazarev, 42 years later in his only interview, conducted by a researcher in a nursing home in the Volga region in 1989, and never publicly released, described this way. Like we'd interrupted them. And then Alexei Volkov stepped forward. He looked directly at Lazarev, and Lazarev looked back, and what Lazarev saw in his eyes was not madness, not damage, not the thing you brace for when you open a room where men have been imprisoned for 15 days without sleep. He saw something that he said in the interview he had never found a word for in Russian, and had spent the next 40 years looking for a word for in any other language, and had not found it. He said, it was like looking at a man who had seen something so far away that his eyes had stopped working at the distance you and I work at. Like looking at a man whose eyes were set for something that wasn't in the room, wasn't in any room. Alexei opened his mouth. And what came out was not Russian. What you just heard was only the beginning. What Alexei said, what came out of his mouth in those first seconds after the door opened, was recorded. There was a microphone unit in the ceiling of the corridor outside the chamber, standard facility monitoring. The tape exists. It was transcribed. The transcription exists. And according to the 3 people who have claimed, across 4 decades of investigation, to have read that transcription, what Alexei Volkov said in the corridor at 03:32 on October 23, 1947, was not in any language any of the 3 could identify. It was, all 3 independently noted, recognizable as language, structured, syntactical, operating according to rules, inflected in ways that implied meaning, implied statement, implied an attempt to communicate something specific and important. What it communicated was not recoverable. The 3 soldiers who were in the corridor when the door opened were Lazarov, who was transferred within 2 weeks, a soldier identified only as Petrov, G, in the unit log, who does not appear in any subsequent Soviet military record, and a corporal named Yuri Belov, who remained in service and retired in 1971, and who, in his retirement, raised chickens on a small farm outside Yekaterinburg and refused, for the rest of his life, to enter any enclosed space without a window. The researchers who observed the opening through the monitoring system, 3 people in the observation room, watching the corridor camera, are documented. 2 are listed by name in the archive. The 3rd is listed only as Researcher D. Researcher D submitted a medical leave request on October 24th and never returned to the program. The medical leave request cites psychological strain of unknown etiology. It was approved in 2 hours by a supervisor who normally took 2 weeks to approve anything. Inside the chamber, now open, now accessible, now flooded with corridor light that made the subjects blink, all 4 of them. The way people blink when a light comes on, the situation was this. 4 men who had been awake for 15 days were standing upright, in good physical health, with expressions of mild inconvenience on their faces, as though the arrival of soldiers and the sudden opening of their door was not rescue but interruption. The gas was still running. Someone had to go back to the subfloor access room to shut off the supply valves. The young researcher sent to do this was alone in that room for 11 minutes with the tank that contained compound 7-Zy. He later said he couldn't remember those 11 minutes clearly. He said it felt like he had been in the room for approximately 45 seconds. The discrepancy was never explained. Alexei knew they were going to bring him out. Knew it the way you know a dream is ending, not because anything has told you, but because the quality of the air changes. The room was going to become ordinary again. He was going to become ordinary again. And he was standing there in the doorway with the corridor light making him squint, and the soldiers looking at him with careful blank faces. And somewhere behind him, Garanin was still in his corner, still making his sounds. And the thought that arrived in Alexei's mind in that moment was not relief, not joy, not the simple human want of outside and daylight and bread. It was grief, the last ordinary thought he would ever have. You will, I think, forgive me if I confess that the subsequent account presents difficulties of a particular variety, difficulties not a fact. For the facts have been established with some precision by those more disposed to catalog the exterior of things than I am inclined to be, but of interpretation, of, if I may be permitted the word, sanity. I do not use the word lightly. I am aware of how such usage sounds. I am aware, acutely and with something approaching terror, that the use of the word sanity in direct relationship to a first-person account is precisely the kind of rhetorical gesture that marks an account as suspect, as the product of a mind operating at the outer margins of its reliability. I have read enough. I know what such a declaration signals. And it is precisely this knowledge, this meta-awareness of my own unreliability, that persuades me my account must begin here, with this declaration, because a mind that had fully left the rails would not recognize the rails, and I recognize them. I can see them from here. I simply can no longer be sure whether I am standing on them or beside them. What I know with certainty: Alexei Volkov was removed from the chamber on the morning of October 23rd and was placed within the hour in a medical examination room in the facility's upper floor. I have read the medical examination notes, those that survived. His physical condition was noted as, and I reproduce this with care, remarkable: 15 days without sleep, no muscular atrophy, no nutritional deficiency indicating reduced food intake. Neurological assessment: within normal parameters, with anomalous exceptions noted separately. The anomalous exceptions are in the missing pages. But the physical record is not what interests me. It is not what has kept me here, in this chair, at this desk, in this inadequate light, unable to leave this material alone for a period of time I would rather not specify. What interests me, what has consumed me, is what Alexei Volkov said to the examining physician during the medical assessment that followed the chamber's opening. He spoke clearly. He spoke in Russian, having apparently, at some point in the interval between the corridor and the examination room, recovered the ability or the willingness to use the language. The physician's notes record 6 statements made by the subject. 5 of those statements are medical in nature, responses to assessment questions. Descriptions of physical sensations, standard examination dialogue. The 6th statement was unprompted. The subject made it midway through the examination and then fell silent and did not speak again for 3 days. The statement is recorded in the physician's notes as follows. Subject stated that he had been shown what occurs between heartbeats. He was unable or unwilling to elaborate. Between heartbeats. I have thought about nothing else since I read those 3 words. I have measured the space between my own heartbeats in those 3 words, which echo now in a rhythm I did not give them, and I have found myself asking, what is there? In that silence, in that space between one beat and the next, between one moment of life and the next, we do not go there. We sleep, and the sleep protects us from it, and that protection is. Was that real? Am I? I am perfectly rational. Let me establish this. Let me set down what I know in order, in the methodical manner of a person whose faculties are entirely intact. The 5 subjects were removed from the chamber. 3 were ambulatory. 1, Garanin, had to be physically extracted from the corner in which he sat. He did not resist, but neither did he assist, and the 2 soldiers required to move him described, in separate statements, the sensation of his body as, and this is not my language, this is their language. I am only recording it as the sensation of lifting a person who was no longer fully present in the weight they occupied. Vasily walked out on his own. He walked past the soldiers without being guided into the corridor and stood there and looked at the ceiling and smiled and said, and this is in the record, it's very thin here, isn't it? No one asked him to elaborate. No one wanted to. The recordings, the audio recordings from the chamber microphones, 15 days of them, were reviewed by a team of 3 linguists brought in from Moscow under classification. The team spent 4 days with the recordings before the project was terminated. The team lead's summary report, 3 paragraphs, survives. The first paragraph is administrative. The second concludes, the vocalizations present in recordings from days 8 through 15 do not correspond to any known language, living or extinct, nor to any documented form of language-adjacent vocalization associated with clinical neurological conditions. They are, however, not random. The structure is too consistent. The patterns repeat in ways that suggest grammar. We cannot identify the grammar. The third paragraph was redacted in its entirety. The grammar of something that is not a language. This is, I know how this sounds. If you are still with me, if you have not yet turned away, write in the comments. The walls remember. Let me know I am not alone in this, because I have been in this material for long enough that the isolation of it has acquired a specific weight, And that weight is, I need to know that the knowledge I am transmitting is landing somewhere in someone, in another mind that is intact enough to receive it. Write it. Let me know you're there. Then come back. Because what follows? What follows is the part I have not told anyone. The neurological assessment of Alexei Volkov, performed on October 23, 1947, included a standard reflex response battery. All reflexes normal, all pathways intact. One anomaly, one finding that the examining neurologist marked with a star in his notes and then wrote beside the star the word impossible, then scratched it out, then wrote it again. The electroencephalogram, a procedure then in its early institutional use, imprecise but available at this facility, produced a reading during the assessment. The reading showed normal waking brain activity on all measured frequencies, except one frequency, present, sustained, rhythmic, that the neurologist noted he could not find in any reference material available to him. He noted it was precisely the frequency of the sound that had been occurring in the chamber vents. The sound that had not, according to the engineers, been produced by the vents. You see how it accumulates. One fact upon another, each one explicable in isolation, and yet together they form a weight that presses down upon everything the rational mind has constructed to keep itself safe. The safe room of reason, the locked chamber of logic, and something on the other side. Something has been knocking. I know this is exactly how it begins. I have read the accounts. I know the shape of the descent. You observe something that doesn't fit. You try to fit it. It doesn't fit. You try again. It still doesn't fit. And then, in the space between one attempt and the next, you realize the problem is not with the object. The problem is with the frame. The frame. Alexei Volkov was released from the facility on the date is unclear. The document exists. The date on the document has been obscured. Not redacted, obscured, a different process. The kind you do with your own hand in your own records when you decide you would rather not know precisely when something happened. The release documentation notes his physical condition as stable, his psychological condition as under observation, his next of kin notification status as pending. He went somewhere. The researcher who spent 2 years trying to locate Alexei Volkov post-experiment found, eventually, a death certificate, dated 1953. The cause of death on the certificate, cardiac arrest, age 37, registered in a city 2,000 kilometers from the facility, under a name that is not quite Alexei Volkov, one letter different. One letter, which is either a clerical error or not a clerical error, and I cannot keep pretending certainty I don't. He died in 1953, if it was him, if the certificate is his. The cardiac arrest occurred, and this is the last thing in the record, the last documented fact I have found about this man, the last marker in the paper trail at 03:32 in the morning, the exact time the chamber door was opened. But do not for one moment believe that you are simply listening to a story. What I am telling you is real. It has always been real. And the reason I know this, the reason I cannot stop, is that it is still happening, right now, as I speak these words to you in the dark. And so my mind, what remained of it, turned at last to the question I had been circling for days. Not what had I seen, but what precisely had seen me. What the preceding accounts establish, taken together and assessed with whatever clinical distance this investigator can now muster, is not a story of human suffering. That is the error all prior investigators have made. They have looked at the Russian sleep experiment as a story about 5 men, their deterioration, their transformation, their ultimate unclassifiable state. They have treated it as a document of human experience pushed to its extreme. It is nothing of the sort. 5 men are negligible. They are irrelevant to the actual subject of the account, just as the particular bacteria on the glass slide are irrelevant to the microscope. They are present. They are the medium through which the observation occurs, and they are not the point. The point is what observed them. There exists, in the cosmological architecture of this universe, a region of reality. I shall not call it a dimension, as the term has acquired too many colloquial and fantastical associations to serve precise thinking. A region that is coextensive with ordinary spacetime, but occupies what I can only describe as the reverse face of consciousness. The waking mind, directed outward, perceives the ordinary world. But consciousness is not a window facing in one direction only. It is a door. And on the other face of that door, the side toward which the sleeping mind drifts in its nightly cycles, without ever quite arriving, something has always been present. Something of considerable antiquity. Dr. Igor Petrov, Institute for Consciousness Studies, Prague, oral testimony, recorded 1997. What the old folklore calls dremeval is not a name. It is a classification. It is the word a culture uses when it has perceived something vast enough to require a category, but not vast enough in its own cognitive framework to permit full description. Every major culture has such a category. Every major culture has developed, independently, protections against approaching it. The sleep cycle is the most fundamental of those protections. It is not coincidental. It is adaptive. Something encountered this thing long ago and survived, and encoded the survival strategy in the biological architecture of every descendant. Sleep as mercy. Sleep as barrier. Sleep as the wall between the ordinary mind and something that, if fully perceived, rewrites everything behind the eyes. Consider the implications of this researcher's statement against the documented evidence of the experiment. 15 days of continuous wakefulness, enforced by a compound whose formula remains classified. In that period, cognitive enhancement, perceptual expansion, communication in unknown language structures, physical resilience exceeding all biological expectations, neurological frequency signatures that match sounds produced by sources that physically cannot produce them. These are not the symptoms of a mind deteriorating. These are the symptoms of a mind becoming capable of perceiving what it was designed never to perceive. The question is not what happened to 5 Soviet subjects in a sealed chamber in 1947. The question is what perceived them in the 47 seconds between heartbeats, for it perceives everything in those spaces, always has, always will, and found them capable at last of perceiving back. Fighting this is meaningless. Comprehending it is meaningless. These men were not victims of an experiment. They were, in the most literal cosmological sense, accidental witnesses to something that has existed since before the first heartbeat sounded in any living chest. Their suffering, such as it was incidental. Their transformation was the point. And the entity, if entity is the word, and I submit that it is not adequate but will have to serve, did not cause their transformation. It was simply, for the first time, seen, and being seen is what it does to things. I must attempt here what every previous investigator of this material has declined to attempt, a description. I approach this task with full awareness of its inherent failure. What I am describing cannot be described, not in any language, not with any available vocabulary, not with any metaphor or analogy drawn from the world of ordinary human experience, which is all that human language is equipped to convey. And yet I have collected, from every account I have been able to access, the researchers' reports, the survivor testimony, the redacted materials that I have had partially translated, the journals and letters and inadvertent confessions of people who were adjacent to this material and absorbed more of it than they intended, something that approximates or approaches the approximate vicinity of a partial description. It is not a creature. The word creature implies an organism, a thing with biology, with appetite in the animal sense, with a relationship to survival that presupposes it might not survive. None of these apply. It does not eat. It does not want in any sense that animal desire can illuminate. It does not threaten, and it does not welcome. It simply is, in the most primary and irreducible use of that verb, a state of being so unqualified by limitation or definition that human cognition, built as it is for the identification and classification of bounded things, cannot process it as a single entity at all. The mind breaks it into parts. The parts are each terrible in their own right. The whole as the whole cannot be held in a human mind simultaneously. That is, I suspect, precisely the point. What the subjects perceive, what can be reconstructed from their behavior, their vocalizations, their neurological assessments, the testimony of researchers who witnessed aspects of it through the buffer of the observation glass, is something that occupies the reverse face of consciousness, the way the ocean occupies its basin. The basin is finite. The ocean presses against every surface. The ocean has been pressing against every surface for as long as there has been a basin to press against. Gorchakov, in the room with his blank papers and his non-letter markings, was not going mad. He was attempting to transcribe. He was attempting to write down the structure of something that exists in a dimension where structure takes forms for which no human symbolic system has developed notation. The marks he made were not psychotic scrawl. They were the most rigorous intellectual effort of his life. They were also, almost certainly, accurate. We will never know what they said because no one who could read them has been found, and because the papers were destroyed by whom, for what reason, the documentation does not specify, but I think we can guess at the reasoning. Some things are more manageable as questions than as answers. The people who destroyed those papers understood that. They were trying to be kind. I am not going to be kind. The language Garanin spoke, that the subjects in their later days used with each other and attempted to direct toward the observation glass, was not invented. It was not the product of neurological damage producing random vocalizations. It was a real language. The linguists who analyzed the recordings knew this. Their report says so explicitly. The structure is too consistent. The patterns repeat. There is grammar. What they decline to write, what I have been told, by a source I cannot name in this account, was discussed in the room and not committed to record, is that the language was not human in origin. This does not mean it was alien in origin. It means it predates the human capacity for language entirely. It means something was speaking long before we developed ears to hear. Others knew. This is the fact that recalibrates everything that precedes it. The fact that should not, on reflection, surprise anyone who has been paying attention to the pattern of institutional behavior surrounding this experiment, but which nonetheless produces, in its documentation, a specific quality of dread that I find impossible to neutralize with analysis. Others knew. Before 1947, others had arrived at this threshold by different means, and had seen what was on the other side and had come back changed, and had told people who had the power to either record or suppress what they were told, and those people had suppressed it, and then had, eventually, proceeded to deliberately reproduce the conditions of exposure. This is not speculation. The archive contains, in documents that are dated between 1941 and 1946, during the period when Compound 7 Xi was being developed, a series of intelligence reports. Intelligence reports summarizing the accounts of individuals who had undergone natural extended wakefulness events, medical conditions, extreme circumstances, situations in which ordinary human biology had been pushed past its design limits without intervention. What happens to people who reach 12, 14, 16 days of natural wakefulness? The reports summarize these accounts with the same clinical neutrality that the experiment's own documentation uses. But there are annotations, handwritten in a margin in ink that is slightly different from the original document added later by someone who read these reports after the fact. The annotations are brief, consistent, in the same handwriting throughout. They say in each case, beside the description of what the naturally deprived subject described seeing, confirmed, not unconfirmed, not under investigation, not subject to verification. Confirmed, which means someone, somewhere before the experiment, had a reference point against which to check these accounts. Someone already knew what the border looked like. Someone had already been there, or had received an account from someone who had, that was reliable enough to serve as a confirmation standard. Who was that person? That question is in the sealed pages. I know it is. I can identify its outline from the negative space around it, the documents that exist, the documents that should exist and don't, the gaps where the answer was and was removed. The answer is there in those pages, in the 42 pages that exist in the catalog and nowhere else. I have been trying to access those pages for 9 years. 3 months ago, I received, through a channel I will not describe, a photograph of one page. 1. The photograph is partial. The edge of the text was cut from the image before it was sent to me. A deliberate editing, as though whoever sent it wanted me to know the answer existed but not to know it fully. What I can read in the partial page is this: a name, a date, and the first 4 words of a sentence that was cut off before its conclusion. The name is Vasily. The date is October 1939. And the first 4 words of the sentence are, "He did not return." What you just heard was only the beginning. Let us speak plainly as the material permits, which is not very plainly at all, about what the Russian sleep experiment was ultimately investigating. Not the effects of stimulants on wakefulness, not the military applications of sleep suppression. What the program was investigating from its inception was the border, the threshold at which the human mind, stripped of the protection of sleep, sustained by a compound that kept the biological machinery running without allowing the nightly retreat from full consciousness, becomes capable of perceiving what exists on the other side. The cosmological implication of this, and I raise it not to philosophize, but because it is the only framework within which the documented facts become coherent, is staggering in a way that makes staggering seem like an inadequate descriptor. If the sleep cycle is protected, then what it protects against is real. If the border is a border, then what is on the other side is real. If language exists that predates human language, then the speaker of that language is real. What has existed in the space between heartbeats, in the space between sleep and waking, in the negative geography of the unconscious border, is real. It has always been real. The Slavic manuscripts called it by one name. Other traditions have other names. The NKVD gave it a file number. None of these designations begin to account for the actual scale of what they designate. Consider, the experiment exposed 5 men to this reality for 15 days. 15 days of direct, unmediated contact with something so vast and ancient that the entire span of human civilization represents less than a single moment in its existence. 5 men, 15 days. The effects were enhanced cognition, accelerated perception, neurological repatterning, the acquisition of a language not of human origin, and a progressive disinterest in returning to ordinary consciousness. Now consider, the experiment was run once, officially. What has been described thus far represents only the outermost fragment of the truth, the portion that human language can approximate. What lies beneath that layer, what the deepest accounts suggest, is something for which no preparation is adequate. Nothing that follows can be unheard. You were warned. I have been awake for 41 hours. This is not relevant. I acknowledge this is not relevant. I acknowledge it and I proceed. The material demands proceeding. The material does not pause for the convenience of the investigator. It does not wait. It does not sleep. It does not. Alexei Volkov crossed a line. I have established this. I have traced the crossing with some precision, and what I have found, what I cannot stop looking at, is that the crossing was not sudden. It was not the dramatic leap across an obvious boundary. It was the accumulation of small increments. The name not remembered here, the rationalization abandoned there, the old world falling away quietly, piece by piece, day by day, with the specific soft violence of a man who is not losing something but replacing it. Replacing it. Who is replacing it? I am aware of something. I am aware that this investigation has been going on for longer than I intended. I am aware that the number of hours I have spent with this material, the documents, the audio, the transcriptions, the photographs, the letters, constitutes something in the vicinity of what the subjects experienced. Not in duration. I have not been awake for 15 days, but in immersion, in the sustained and focused attention that this material requires and rewards and then demands, and then requires more insistently, in a way that feels less like intellectual engagement and more like. I am aware that the investigation and the subject of the investigation have begun to share certain qualities. I am aware of this. I want you to know I am aware of it. What I cannot determine, and this is the thing that will not stop pressing against the inside of my skull, is whether that awareness is evidence of rational function, or whether it is the thing itself, the narrators who note their own unreliability, the ones who insist on their sanity with the specific desperation that distinguishes insisting from simply being. I have read those accounts. I have classified them. I have, in another version of myself, that stood earlier and farther from this material, understood exactly what it meant when a narrator could not stop telling you they were fine. He was never fine. They were never fine. The question I have been circling and am now standing directly in front of, the question that has been the real subject of this entire investigation since the first document I found, and has been the thing I am afraid to say since I found the answer. The question is not what the experiment revealed. The question is, what did the experiment release? The chamber was opened, the gas dispersed, the subjects were removed. The border, once opened, does not close on its own. The subjects were separated, examined, placed in individual rooms, sedated heavily, the records indicate, with compounds designed to force sleep. Standard protocol for any involuntary wakefulness incident. Force the body back into the cycle. Force the mind back behind its barrier. Restore the protection that the experiment had removed. 3 of them slept. Garanin did not. Garanin, in his individual room under full sedation, with enough pharmaceutical intervention to put a horse unconscious for 12 hours, sat upright on the medical cot and continued making the sounds, continued in the language that was not a language, continued with his eyes open and his color good and his vital signs perfect and his face bearing exactly the expression that had been on it since when? Since day 6, day 7. How long had Garanin been there, while the rest of them were still here? The night physician on duty, who spent 40 minutes with Garanin while trying to get his sedation to take effect, filed a report. The report is 3 paragraphs long, and the final paragraph reads, "Subject appears unaware of surroundings. Subject appears unaware of present circumstances in any conventional sense. Subject continues vocalization in unidentified language." Subject responded to this physician's presence by turning to face me directly, and I record this because precision is required, by saying, clearly and in Russian, a single phrase. The phrase was, "He's already here." Subject then returned to unidentified language vocalization. I have no interpretation of this statement to offer. "He's already here." I want to tell you that those 3 words, arriving in Russian, alone in the field of incomprehensible sound, perfectly articulated. I want to tell you that those 3 words are ambiguous, that they could mean any number of things, that a person in an extreme neurological state is not a reliable source of information. I want to tell you that the words have a subject, he, a subject, a verb, a location, here, precise, a statement, not an exclamation, not a warning, a fact. Like a man doing a body count calmly, nodding one more presence than expected. I know who was in that room. The physician, Garanin, and whoever Garanin was announcing. I have been avoiding something. I have been in this account, across all these sections, across all these hours of documenting and analyzing and presenting and representing. I have been building toward a statement that I have not made, a fact that I have orbited without landing on, a conclusion that the evidence supports, that everything I have presented points to, that any reader following this account with adequate attention has likely arrived at independently and has been waiting for me to confirm. I have not confirmed it because the confirmation changes things. Here is what the investigation of the Russian sleep experiment ultimately reveals. When you trace every thread to its origin, when you find every document and read every account and sit with every inconsistency until it resolves into pattern, the experiment did not fail. It achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. 5 men, sustained at the border of consciousness by a compound that kept them biologically alive while preventing the retreat into the sleep cycle's protection, made contact with what exists on the other side of that border. The contact was successful. The communication was successful. The language that developed was real, was functional, was a genuine medium of exchange between human minds operating at the border and whatever occupies that border's other side. And the entity, the presence, the ancient, vast, cosmologically indifferent thing that has existed in the space between heartbeats since before the first heartbeat, communicated back. This is what the missing pages contain. This is what the annotations that said, confirmed, confirmed. This is what the researcher who added those annotations already knew. And what was communicated, what the entity transmitted through the border, through the language that predated human language, into the minds of 5 men who had been held at the threshold long enough to receive it, is the one thing I have been unable to say in 50,000 words of investigation. Because I know what it said. And it said, I have always been able to come through. I was waiting for you to open the door. Enough of the academic distance. What was found in that room deserves to be described as it was, in full, in light, with nothing hidden. Day 15. The door opened at 03:47. The gas had been running for 359 hours and 47 minutes. What the soldiers found was not, as the clinical language of the surviving documentation tries to convey, a situation of subjects in unusual psychological states. What they found was 4 men who had been physically rewritten. Not in ways that were immediately visible. Let me be clear about this. From across the corridor before anyone stepped inside, the 4 subjects looked like men. They had the shapes of men, the proportions, the posture. They moved. Alexei stepped forward, Vasily stood, Cheskov opened his eyes, Morozov lowered his hands with the fluid ease of men who were healthy, rested, entirely in command of their bodies. It was proximity that changed things. The first soldier to step into the threshold was close enough to Alexei to smell him. What he smelled was not the expected product of 15 days without bathing in a sealed room. It was clean. Specifically clean, not sterile, not bleached, but clean in the way that certain places at certain times of day smell clean. River water in early morning, forest floor after rain, something organic and indifferent and very old. Alexei's skin, where it was visible at his collar and his wrists, had a quality to it that the soldier described in his statement as luminous, and then immediately crossed out and replaced with pale. But the first word was the true word. It gave off light, not dramatically, not supernaturally in the movie monster way of special effects and hysteria, just slightly more light than skin should give off. The way a thing gives off light when something is happening inside it that generates heat. Morozov's left forearm, where the laceration had been 12 days since the cut, without treatment, without cleaning, without any medical intervention, was sealed. Not scarred, sealed. The skin was continuous and smooth and showed no indication that a wound had ever been there except for one detail. The new skin was slightly, almost imperceptibly, a different color from the surrounding skin. The color of the marking he had made in his blood on the table. Not red, the color blood becomes after a day on a surface. Brown rust. And the shape of the mark was there, pressed into the skin from beneath, like a watermark in paper, visible only at certain angles in certain light. Garanin had not moved when the door opened. He sat in his corner, cross-legged, exactly as he had sat for days, and from the doorway he looked like a man meditating. When the soldiers moved to lift him, he didn't resist, as the log recorded what they felt was this: the weight was wrong. Not lighter than a man of his build should be, heavier, denser, as though the space he occupied contained more of him than had been there on day one. As though 15 days at the border had added something to him, rather than taking anything away. His eyes, when the light hit them properly, did not reflect the way human eyes reflect. They absorbed. Almost no reflection at all. Light went in and did not come back in the ordinary way, the way it comes back from every wet surface in every room you have ever been in. It simply went in. He was still making the sounds. In the open room, in the open air, no longer contained by the chamber walls, they carried differently. They had harmonics, undertones that the soldiers felt in their chests before they consciously processed them as sound. One soldier later described it as the feeling before thunder, the feeling in the air when the charge has built and the strike is milliseconds away. Garanin looked up, his eyes absorbing the light, giving back nothing, found the soldier's face with the precision of a man who sees extremely clearly. He spoke one sentence, in Russian clearly, before returning to the other language. The translation of what he said: it came with us. I want to speak about Vasily. Not because Vasily is the most disturbing element of what happened in the chamber. He is not, or rather, he is disturbing in a different way, a way that sits beside the visceral horror of the other subjects, rather than participating in it. Vasily is disturbing in the way that a locked room is disturbing, not because of what you can see, but because of the specific quality of the not knowing. He had not eaten in 6 days officially. His weight was unchanged. His physical condition, by every assessment the researchers could perform through observation, was better on day 15 than on day 1. He was, in every external measurement, improving, flourishing. The only changes documented were the light quality in his eyes, which had shifted in the same way as Garanin's, and the habit of standing at the observation window looking up at the glass, which had developed around day 10 and continued without interruption. He walked out of the chamber voluntarily. He walked past the soldiers with the ease of a man passing through a crowd he is not part of, unbothered, moving at his own pace. In the corridor he stopped. He looked at the ceiling, the facility's institutional concrete, unpainted, marked with the particular stains of old water infiltration. He looked at it the way you look at the sky when you step out of a long meeting, not with hunger but with recognition. Ah, yes, this. When the medical team approached him, he turned to them. He was pleasant. That is the word multiple accounts use, pleasant, cooperative. He answered questions. He allowed the physical examination. He behaved in every particular like a healthy man undergoing a routine assessment after a voluntary research participation. He was the easiest of the 4 to process. Except, his body temperature was 91 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal is 98.6. At 91, the clinical term is hypothermia. At 91, a person is typically confused, disoriented, unable to concentrate. At 91, the body is failing. Vasily was pleasant, cooperative, clear-eyed, alert. The examining physician took his temperature 3 times. Different thermometers. Same result. He noted it in the file and then noted his own confusion in the file, which is not standard practice and indicates that the act of writing the number down did not make it feel more real. When asked if he felt cold, Vasily said, "I feel exactly as I feel." When asked if he felt anything, sensation, physical awareness, temperature, he considered the question carefully. Then, "I feel what it feels like to stand here. I don't know what to compare it to anymore." He was asked about the other subjects, about what had occurred in the chamber, about what he had experienced in 15 days of sustained wakefulness. He answered each question with the careful, measured honesty of someone who is trying very hard to translate from one language into another and knows the translation is imperfect. His answers were not evasive. They were simply displaced. off by 1 degree in every direction. The way a person sounds when they have been explaining things for so long in a different language that the native one comes out slightly translated. He said, "We were shown the size of things." He said, "We were shown what the interval contains." He said, "We were shown that the interval is not empty." Then he stopped. He looked at the examining physician. He said, "And this is the last statement Vasily made before being transferred to the secure facility where he remained for the rest of his documented life. You are going to want to seal the room. I understand that impulse. I want to tell you as clearly as I can that what was in the room is not in the room anymore. What happened to Garanin in the medical facility is in the file. I will describe it. I will not soften it. You came here for the truth, and this is the truth. Garanin was placed in a room, 4 walls, ceiling, floor, a cot, a single light, a window too high to reach. He was given food which he did not eat. He was given water which he did not drink. He was sedated every 12 hours with enough compound to produce unconsciousness in an otherwise healthy man within minutes. The sedation did not produce unconsciousness. It produced, the nursing log describes this with the detached helplessness of someone who has run out of clinical vocabulary, a stillness. Garanin went still under sedation. He did not sleep. The distinction was visible. Sleep has a quality, a depth, a looseness in the body that is involuntary and unmistakable. Garanin had none of it. He was still the way a house is still at 3 a.m., not resting but waiting. The sounds continued at the same volume and in the same patterns during sedation as during waking. On the 3rd day in the facility, Garanin stopped making the sounds. For 4 hours, he was silent. The nursing staff logged it as a possible improvement. The duty physician was notified. Plans were made to reassess his treatment. Then at exactly 03:32 a.m., the exact minute the chamber door had been opened, 9 days prior, Garanin stood up. He stood with a smoothness and quickness that the nurse in the corridor, watching through the door's observation slot, described as not the way a man stands up, not the sequential weight shift and leverage of a human rising from a horizontal position, all at once, instantaneous, present then standing, with no interval. He walked to the wall. He put both hands flat against the surface. He pressed. The wall resisted for 14 seconds. The nurse had enough time to note the time, note the behavior, note that she should call the physician, reach for the telephone, pick up the receiver, and begin to speak. She had enough time to say the room number into the telephone. Then the wall did not resist. This is the word in the report, gave. The wall gave, not crumbled, gave. The way a membrane gives. The way a surface that is not truly a boundary yields when something on the other side chooses to press from both directions simultaneously. Garanin stepped through. The wall was solid on inspection. Immediately after, with all personnel available, the physician present, the security staff present, and a structural engineer brought in from another floor of the facility. Solid. No breach. No damage. Concrete unremarkable in every testable parameter. Garanin was gone. He was never found. And in the room on the other side of that wall, a storage room, empty. No point of egress other than a sealed door that had not been opened. On the floor, in the center of the room, written in something that the laboratory would identify as not matching any biological substance in its reference catalog, was a single symbol. The same symbol Morozov had drawn on the table in his blood. The same symbol, confirmed by photograph comparison, that Dr. Gorchakov had been marking on blank paper in the records room. This is the part that was edited out, cut from every version you have ever encountered, because someone decided you could not handle the truth of what was found in that place. They were trying to be kind. I am not going to be kind. You asked for the truth. Here it is. What remains after the worst is a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of absence, not the silence that follows an explosion that rings with its own cessation. The silence that followed the Russian sleep experiment was the silence of something that had shifted so fundamentally that the world afterward occupied a different position relative to everything than the world before. Quiet, ordinary, unremarkable in its texture, just slightly off, slightly wrong. The same way a familiar room is slightly wrong when you come back to it after someone who belonged to it is gone. Everything in its place, everything unchanged. The wrongness coming from inside the room, not from anything you can name or move or fix. The facility was decommissioned. Not immediately. Bureaucracies do not move fast enough to acknowledge emergencies in real time, and the experiment's failure officially was filed as outcome inconsistent with research parameters, a phrase that had already been used once before in this program's history and would not be used again because there would not be another experiment officially. The equipment was removed. The chamber was sealed with standard institutional permanence, concrete poured, access restricted, file closed. The remaining 3 subjects, Alexei, Cheskov, Morozov, were processed, monitored, treated for a condition that has no clinical name because no clinical framework existed then, or exists now, adequate to describe what had happened to them. They were by every external measure alive and functional. They spoke in Russian reliably, though sometimes with intervals in the unfamiliar language that they did not appear to notice, and that decreased in frequency over the subsequent months. They ate. They moved. They responded to social interaction with the slightly displaced quality of people who are translating continuously between 2 modes of perception and finding the translation tiring. 3 researchers remained on the project in a reduced monitoring capacity. Their task, observation, documenting any further anomalous behavior, filing reports that went to an address in Moscow that, when a researcher in 1991 attempted to trace it, turned out to correspond to a department that had been administratively dissolved in 1953. Cheskov's final monitored statement before he was released from observation in February 1948 was this: "I miss it the way you miss a place you've never been. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't make sense, but that's what I have." That is what remained. That is the world after. Men who remembered the border, who carried in their bodies the neurological signature of what they had briefly touched, living out their ordinary lives in the ordinary world. Eating, speaking, existing. In the intervals between heartbeats. Alongside everything that had always been there. November 1947 through January 1948. Official record of post-experiment outcomes. Subject 1, ALEKSEIVOLKOV. Released from observation January 3, 1948. Returned to active military service. Service record ends abruptly in 1951 with the notation Administrative Transfer, Classification Level 7. No further official record until the death certificate of 1953, which may or may not be his. One document, a brief report filed by a regional health authority in 1952, references a man matching his description who presented at a medical facility complaining of interruptions in continuous experience. The physician's note on this presentation: patient describes sensation of events occurring in gaps between moments. Patient appears distressed but is medically unremarkable. Referred to psychiatric evaluation. Whether he attended the evaluation, not recorded. Subject 2, DMITRICHESKOV. Released from observation February 11, 1948. Remained in the Soviet Union. Died 1971. Cause of death, heart failure. Age, 55. The engineer who processed his estate noted in a personal letter to a colleague that Cheskov's apartment contained, covering every wall of every room, sheets of paper covered in a symbol. Always the same symbol. Thousands of iterations. The letter describes it as precise, like engineering notation, like something that means something specific in a system I don't have the key to. Subject 3, NIKOLAIMOROZOV. Transferred to a psychiatric facility in December 1947. Diagnosis: Reality perception disorder, chronic, irremediable. He remained institutionalized until 1989, 42 years, when in the brief administrative chaos of the Soviet Union's final years, he was released. He was 70 years old. He lived for 3 years before his death in a facility for the elderly in St. Petersburg. The staff noted that he was quiet, gentle, cooperative, and entirely lucid. He was also noted as spending long periods each day sitting very still with his eyes closed. When asked what he was doing, he said, "Listening. Don't worry, it's not going anywhere." Nurse Tatyana Bredova, St. Petersburg Elder Care, testimony 1992. He was a lovely man, very calm. He used to help the other residents. He was patient with people who had memory problems, who got confused, who were frightened. He was always kind. But in 42 years of nursing, I never met anyone who slept less. Staff would check on him throughout the night, always awake. Always the same expression, peaceful but not resting. One night I asked him, I said, "Nikolai, don't you sleep?" He smiled at me. He said, "I sleep between things." Bredova retired in 1995. She reports that she has not thought about Morozov's statement until nights when something wakes her for no reason. Subject 4, PYOTRGARANIN. See previous documentation. Missing. Status, unknown. No death certificate on record. No further official documentation. Subject 5, VASILI, no surname on record. Transferred to a classified facility. Date of transfer, October 28, 1947. Location, not in the surviving documentation. Outcome, not in the surviving documentation. The index entry for his file notes it as active. The most recent index update, 1989, after which the index entry simply stops. Other cases, there are always other cases. They are not called the Russian sleep experiment in official records. They do not reference each other in official records, but the pattern is consistent enough that an investigator who has studied this material long enough begins to recognize it the way a physician recognizes a pathology across different patients, not by name, but by presentation. Germany, 1953, a research facility in Bavaria, 3 subjects, a compound described in the single surviving document as a derivative of an earlier Soviet stimulus formula acquired through intelligence channels. The experiment lasted 9 days before it was terminated. 2 subjects had to be restrained during extraction. 1 extraction team member required psychiatric hospitalization. File classification, highest. Current status, sealed. United States, 1964. Fort Detrick, Maryland. A sleep deprivation study under the MKULTRA umbrella. 7 subjects, 14 days. The final report, partially declassified in 1977, notes anomalous communication patterns in subjects by day 10, and unexpected cross-subject ideation that cannot be attributed to shared information. The project director resigned the following month. The follow-up study that was planned was never initiated. In 1979, a Freedom of Information request produced the cover sheet of the follow-up study's protocol. The title of the protocol, Border Contact, Assessment of Replicability. The rest of the protocol, not released. Japan, 1971. A private pharmaceutical research program. 4 subjects, 11 days. The compound used is described only as a modified stimulant of unknown provenance. On day 8, 1 subject began speaking in a language the research team could not identify. By day 11, all 4 subjects were communicating in this language exclusively. When the experiment was terminated, 3 subjects refused extraction. The 4th cooperated and was taken to a hospital. The hospital's intake notes: patient presence as lucid and coherent. Patient unable or unwilling to communicate in Japanese. Patient's affect described as peaceful. Patient was found unresponsive in room the following morning. No medical cause for unresponsiveness identified. Patient was breathing. Vital signs normal. The patient remained in this state for 11 days, then woke, speaking Japanese, and remembered nothing after day 4 of the experiment. His blood work, taken that day, showed a neurological marker that the testing laboratory had never seen before and could not classify. The most recent case on record, Prague 2003, 3 subjects. 12 days. Compound 7-Xi, the formula finally reproduced by a research team whose funding source has not been publicly identified. The outcome of the Prague experiment has not been publicly reported. The facility where it was conducted was sold in 2004 and converted to offices. The current occupants report that 3 rooms on the lower level, rooms that correspond by floor plan to the chamber used in the experiment, are always cold. The temperature differential, confirmed by building maintenance records, exactly 7.4 degrees below the ambient temperature of every surrounding space. 7.4 degrees. The number means nothing, except that 91 degrees Fahrenheit is 98.6 minus 7.4. Measured weight of last testimony. March 1989. Volga region, Russian Soviet Federative Republic. Private Dmitry Lazarev, the soldier who opened the door. He was 64 years old when the researcher found him. He was in a nursing home in a town that has no reason to appear in any account you would otherwise read. He had been there for 7 years. His admission paperwork, obtained with difficulty, lists the presenting concern as persistent sleep disruption of unknown etiology and associated cognitive symptoms. The cognitive symptoms are not specified. He agreed to be interviewed. The interview lasted 3 hours. What follows is not a complete transcript. The recording from which this account is derived is partial, damaged in sections, and the researcher who conducted it requested that certain portions not be published, a request that will be honored here. What follows is the relevant portion. Private Dmitry Lazarev, Facility Security Detail, October 1947. Interview March 1989. I was 22. They didn't tell us what was inside. They said there were test subjects, research volunteers, who needed to be extracted following the conclusion of an experiment. Standard language. We'd done similar things before. Go in, bring people out, don't ask. The officer who briefed us said, I remember this specifically because it was strange, he said. Do not look any of them directly in the eyes for more than 3 seconds. This is a medical precaution. That's what he said. Medical precaution. I thought it was about infection. I thought they might be contagious somehow. When the door opened, the smell was what hit me first. I told you about the smell, like river water, like something clean from a long way away. And then I saw them standing there. 4 men, healthy, looking at us. And I thought, this is fine, this went fine, they're all right. And then Volkov stepped forward, and I did what I'd been told not to do. I looked at his eyes. I can't tell you what I saw, not because I don't remember, because there aren't words for it in Russian or any other language I speak. I'll tell you this, whatever I saw, it was not only him looking back at me. There was something behind him, not physically, not in the room, but through him, looking out, using his eyes to look at me the way you use a window to look at someone outside. Something was looking at me through that man. And it was not surprised to see me. It had been expecting me. That was 40 years ago. I have not slept more than 3 consecutive hours since that morning. Lazarev died in his sleep, the deepest irony the record permits, in November 1989, 8 months after the interview. The nursing home staff described his final weeks as peaceful. They noted that in his last days he had stopped what had been, for years, a constant habit, lying awake in the night, watching the door of his room with the alert, patient watchfulness of a man waiting for something he had been expecting for a very long time. His last recorded words, to the nurse who checked on him the night he died, at approximately 03:30 a.m. It finally came back. Current status of the Russian sleep experiment. What exists now? The facility, decommissioned in 1948. The physical structure is, depending on which source you consult, either demolished, repurposed as a regional administrative building, or still standing and sealed. 3 separate investigations have identified 3 separate locations in the Ural region as the likely site. None of the 3 have been confirmed or denied by any official Russian governmental body. The archive, partially accessible between 1991 and 1999, restricted again in 1999. The re-restriction was not publicly announced. It was discovered when a researcher who had previously accessed portions of the file found the access revoked without notification or explanation. When she inquired, the response, from an office that had not existed when she made the original access, stated that the materials were under ongoing review and not available for public consultation at this time. The review has been ongoing for 25 years. The formula for compound 7-zy, officially declassified in 2016. The declassified document is 4 pages long and describes a stimulant compound using standard pharmacological notation. It has been analyzed by 3 independent pharmacologists who have each concluded the same thing. The compound described is a stimulant, an effective one, capable of maintaining wakefulness for extended periods. It is not unusual. It is not, in any way that they can identify, the compound that produced the outcomes documented in the experiment. The real formula remains classified. Dr. Yuri Baranov, Pharmacological Research Institute, Moscow, Public Statement, 2017. What was declassified in 2016 is not what was in the chamber. I don't know how to be more direct about this. The compound described in the release document does not produce the neurological effects documented in the original research. Something else was in that room. The question of what it was is not a pharmacological question. The document that should not exist but does. In the Russian State Archives public catalog, accessible online, there is a reference to a file designated NKVD 1947XD7 continuation. The reference notes a date of creation, October 1947. It notes a date of last modification, 2019. The file itself is not accessible, but it was modified in 2019. Someone in 2019 opened that file and changed something in it and closed it again. The Russian sleep experiment did not end in 1947. Something in those records is still being maintained by someone who is keeping it current. There is an apartment in St. Petersburg that has been unoccupied since 1953. The building is otherwise fully occupied, 13 units. The 13th unit, Unit 13, which is not the result of triskaidekaphobia but of the building's original numbering system, which counted storage rooms and utility spaces, has not been rented since the death of its last occupant. The building manager, when asked, says there is nothing wrong with the unit. The building manager says it's just that tenants don't stay. They move in and within a few months they move out. And when they are asked why, they say different things. The neighbors are strange. The light is bad. They found somewhere better. They just didn't feel comfortable. One former tenant said he felt like someone else was in the unit with him. He acknowledged immediately afterward that he knew this was not a reasonable thing to report about an apartment. He said it anyway. The unit has been painted recently. The walls are clean. The fixtures work. The radiator functions. The windows close completely and let in very little noise. It is cold, not dramatically cold, not cold enough to report, just slightly cooler than the surrounding rooms, the surrounding building, the surrounding street, as though something in the room is drawing warmth away from the air, slowly, steadily, without stopping. The last occupant before the current period of vacancy was a man whose name in the building register is listed as A. Volkov. He moved in January 1951. He moved out, or is listed as having moved out, in November 1953. The unit was found after he left with all his belongings still inside. His clothing, his books, his papers, everything still in place, as though he had stepped out for a short errand and not returned. The papers were ordinary letters, documents, notes. The building manager at the time went through them looking for next of kin contact information. He found one page that was different from the rest. He threw it away because he couldn't identify what it was. He described it years later to his daughter, who told a neighbor, who wrote it down in a letter that has survived by accident in a collection of family papers. It was covered in a symbol, just one symbol repeated, filling the entire page in neat, careful, consistent rows. He said it looked like something between a letter and a diagram. He said it gave him a headache to look at it. He said it felt like trying to focus on something that kept shifting slightly every time you almost had it in focus. He threw it away. The unit is still slightly cold. It continues. That is the last thing that must be said, and it is the thing that all other things have been preparing the listener to receive. Not, it continued, not, it once occurred and then ended and left its aftermath, and that aftermath is what I have described. It continues, present tense, ongoing. The entity, the presence, the ancient indifference, the thing in the interval has not stopped. It has not been addressed. It has not been contained or classified or neutralized or understood. It existed before the first heartbeat of the first living thing on this planet, and it will exist after the last heartbeat of the last, and in the narrow span between those two events, events that constitute, in the mathematics of its existence, less than a moment, the human species has been going about its business, building, nomming things, sleeping especially, faithfully cycling between the waking world and the sleeping world, spending every night of every life in the realm where this presence resides, moving through it without awareness in the way a dreaming fish is unaware of the deep trench beneath it. The protection has worked. The barrier has held. 8 billion people on this planet sleep every night and wake every morning, and the vast majority of them will never know, will go to their graves never knowing what they passed through on the far side of consciousness while their bodies rested and their minds were kept by the ancient mercy of biology from perceiving what perceived them. But the border was crossed. In October 1947, in a sealed chamber in the Ural Mountains, 5 men were held at the threshold for 15 days, and something, for the first time in the history of human civilization, looked back through human eyes and saw the waking world from the other side, and understood with the calm of something that has never been in a hurry that the door was not locked from its side. The 5 men are gone. The experiment is filed. The records are sealed and maintained and updated, last in 2019, by someone whose name is not on any document I have been able to find. But the border remains. It will always remain, and you have been crossing it every night of your life. And you are crossing it tonight. I have been awake for too long. I know this. I have known this for some time. The investigation has taken, I cannot accurately account for the hours, the days. I know that I began with the documents, the archive, the clinical precision of recorded fact, and I know that somewhere after the pose sections, somewhere after the confession, somewhere in the accumulated weight of this material, the distance between myself and the subject collapsed. I know this. I am nomming it because nomming it is the last instrument of the rational mind, the last function of a faculty that has been under sustained pressure for longer than is advisable. What I know about the border, it is thin. It is always thin. It is thinner at certain hours, in certain states, in certain conditions of sustained wakefulness. I know that the experiments documented here were not the first, and not the last, and that the formula for compound 7xi is not the only way to hold a person at the threshold long enough to see through it. I know that sustained, focused immersion in this material, reading about the border, thinking about the border, writing about the border for hours that stretch into days. I know what the sound is, in the vents or the room, or I know now what Garanin was listening to. I know because it has been saying my name since the 7th hour.